Now, you're the first Indigenous woman to be elected to Australia's House of Representatives, an historic achievement, but it only happened in 2016. Is there a part of you that feels a little disappointed that it took so long for that milestone to be reached?
It took ridiculously a long time. There is a man who was a minister, actually, who is in the House of Representatives. He's from WA, Western Australia, and he's been there a little bit longer than me. But the notion that it took all that time is, of course, disappointing. But I'm incredibly proud, and the community that I come from is very, very happy and proud, and very much sees me as their person in Canberra.
Well, can you tell us a little bit more about that community and your experiences growing up? Because it took a long time before you got to know your Aboriginal side of the family. Why was that?
It did. I'm a member of the Wiradjuri Nation, and for our international audience, that is a very large nation of First Nations people in the southwest of New South Wales. So it's sort of on the eastern seaboard, but in the centre of the state that I live in. I didn't meet my father until I was 28 years old, and I was raised by my great uncle and aunt, who were non-Aboriginal people on my mother's side. I was born in 1957, and in Australia, and I think right across the world, being born out of wedlock and being born as a Aboriginal kid to a non-Aboriginal woman was absolutely shocking. I met my dad when I was 28, and the thing that I will never get past is that we grew up 40 minutes apart, and I had 10 brothers and sisters that I didn't know existed.
Well, here we are now, 2021, well into the 21st century. Do these sorts of things still happen in the Aboriginal community? Can you give us a sense of some of the issues around poverty and injustice for our international audience that the Indigenous community faces?
These things still do happen. I was not part of the stolen generation, which I'll talk about in a moment. But certainly racism and exclusion really is the reason I didn't meet my dad for such a long, long time. But one of the very devastating policies in this country is an era called the forced removal of Aboriginal children from their families. And thousands and thousands and thousands of Aboriginal children, right up to the 1970s, but really from the beginning of last century, or a little bit earlier through to the 1970s, there were thousands of children forcibly taken from their families, brought up in shocking circumstances, many of them abused, and many of them farmed out for basically slave labour in rural properties, in homes as maids, as being there to look after children. There was also the impacts of that really have to be seen, because there is intergenerational trauma, particularly from that era. But Aboriginal people in Australia, to varying degrees, have been denied our culture. I can't speak my language, for example. I've managed to name my children in my language. And there has been, as a result of all of that, much loss of culture, much loss of language, much loss of land, but never loss of identity. And that is really, I think, a testament to the survival of First Nations people in this country. And the other thing, of course, is we've kept our sense of humour. And Aboriginal culture is not a written culture, it's an oral culture. And the stories have been passed on from one generation to another. And that still happens today.
Well, of course, over the past few decades, there have been numerous policy attempts to try and address some of these issues that you've outlined. But if we take a look at the leadership of Australia, it has been overwhelmingly white, middle class, and male. To what extent has this created problems in trying to address these issues?
Well, the leadership, if you mean the political leadership and most of the corporate leadership, is certainly what you've described, middle class, white and male. But the wonderful thing that's happening in Australia is that there has been a real resurgence in the teaching of languages. Young people are proud of who they are, they're strong in their identity. And of course, there are many Aboriginal people now that are entering the political arena, that are doctors, that are dentists, that are lawyers, that are authors, that are dancers, that are athletes, both in the athletic world as well as the football world. And in Australia, we have basically 4 codes of football. And those people are very admired in our community, but the real heroes in our community are those people that work at a community level, the aunties and uncles, we call them, that really do extraordinary work and get very little recognition. And they're the people that are our true heroes.
If we can turn to one of the more recent policies that's been aimed at trying to reduce poverty in the Aboriginal community, there's the rollout of the cashless welfare card. Now, I know that you're opposed to this. Can you explain for our audience what it is, what the problem with it is, how it's been received by the community?
Well, you are completely right. I am opposed to it, and so is the political party that I represent in the federal parliament, the Australian Labor Party. The cashless debit card, everyone, is a mechanism where people who are on, for want of a better term, welfare, are managed by way of this card. It means that 80% of your income is quarantined on this card, and you have 20%, which is discretionary, that goes into your bank account. This is in 4 trial sites in Australia, and through the parliament, we've managed to make sure that it has not been rolled out. Now, some people would say, well, what's wrong with this? You know, there's reciprocity involved, and there is no argument with reciprocity. But from my perspective, this is about controlling people's income, controlling the way it's spent and where you can spend it, and keeping an absolute track of how that money is used. And there is a real question about whether or not this exercise is successful. There has been no decent investigation in my mind, or a conclusive investigation on whether this measure is successful or not.
When you keep these sorts of things in mind, does it explain the resonance that the Black Lives Matter movement had here in Australia with Indigenous communities?
The resonance of the Black Lives Matter movement in Australia was enormous. And what it really focused on was the fact that there is a huge issue in this country, as there is in many first world nations with a colonial history, of the incarceration of First Peoples. And I don't mean just adults, I also mean young people as well, where there is a disproportionate amount of people who are incarcerated. In the late 80s, early 90s in Australia, there was a Royal Commission into Black deaths in custody. It explored hundreds of deaths in custody, and there were no charges laid against any authority or the police as a result of that Royal Commission. There are now more people incarcerated than there were at the time of the Royal Commission, and deaths in custody has continued. And the Black Lives Matter movement really focused on these issues of incarceration and deaths in custody. In fact, there's been a number of deaths that we can talk about over the last 12 months. And the issue about inherent racism, inherent lack of understanding of Aboriginal responsibility and Aboriginal culture. And also there is a big movement in this country as well about the argument of not only enshrining a voice in the Parliament to the Australian Constitution, but also a national process of treaty making and truth telling. And one of the remarkable things about this country, which goes back to the way in which this country was claimed in the name of an English king, was that there, unlike America, Canada, New Zealand, and a number of other countries, similar countries, where there were treaties, there are no treaties that exist in Australia.
If we can turn to the current political climate in Canberra right now, we have a cabinet minister denying a claim of historic rape. There are terrible stories circulating of rape and sexual harassment among staffers. We've had the news that the Liberal MP, Nicole Flint, she was one of the few rising women on the government benches. She's going to step down at the next election and hasn't given any reason for that. I'm wondering how you think Australia can encourage more women, and particularly more Indigenous women, to pursue a political career in this kind of environment.
Well, I really encourage young women to think about a political career. And I think it's important that when we talk about a political career, it's not just being a member of Parliament. There are many ways that you can participate in the political world, as a media advisor, as a policy advisor, as a member of a politician's staff. And I can't comment, and I would never comment on what's happening in other countries, but Australia, whether we like it or not, there is, in my view, a crisis in terms of domestic and sexual violence. In Australia, on average, one woman dies a week at the hands of an intimate or an ex-partner. Now, can you imagine if that was, I don't know, shark attacks once a week that were fatal? It would be front page news. And I think the things that we're seeing in the federal parliament in relation to alleged sexual assaults and so forth are in many ways a reflection of society, where it is a patriarchal society in Australia, whether people want to face that or not. And you only have to look at the fact that in the federal parliament, there are only 22% of people that are women. But I'm very proud to say that in the party that I represent, we are about 50%, because we realised we had a problem many years ago. And we introduced an affirmative action rule where half the women at the local, state, and every level of the Labor Party have to be women. And that applies in the parliaments as well. And I am very also proud to say that the federal Labor shadow cabinet, which I'm a member of, is more women than men. So it's really about a deliberate decision that you're going to do something about this.